Thank you for having me here today. And can everyone hear me properly? Is the sound good? Yeah? Good. And I look forward to talking to you about how to write a great research paper and how to get accepted in a reputable journal. I don't know if many of you have already written papers or published papers. Most of you have in international journals. Okay, yeah. So today I'll give you some advice on how to improve your chances of getting published, so to say. And then I'll also talk about how the editorial process works to give you a better understanding of that, and publishing ethics, and I talk a little bit about open access. Because open access is a movement which is becoming more and more prevalent, especially in Europe, I think, but I think it will also become more prevalent in other parts of the world now. So I'll talk a bit about that as well. And if you have any questions during my presentation, feel free to ask. You know, you don't have to wait till the end to ask your questions. Also, you don't need to take too many notes because my presentation will probably be online on the university website as well, but also Elsevier has a website called Researcher Academy. Hello. And Researcher Academy hosts basically lots of workshops and webinars that Elsevier has already generated. And there's a lot of information for you to find on basically all the topics that we'll discuss today as well. So I'll start with the introduction to scholarly publishing. So basically scholarly publishing was facilitated once the printing press became more common in the world, because the printing press kind of meant that people could produce larger amounts of the same text, and it would be more easy to distribute those texts. And then the House of Elsevier, the publishing house, was founded in 1580, and but initially it didn't publish scientific works. It published more, books and literature, not so much focused on science. And it was only, in the 18th century, I think, that it actually started publishing peer-reviewed journals. And the first peer-reviewed journal that existed was the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in the UK. And this journal was launched by Henry Oldenburg, who actually thought of the idea that if people sent him a manuscript with scientific findings, he thought, it's actually a good idea to send this manuscript to some peers, some of my colleagues on the subject matter, and see what they think of it. And that's how the peer review process actually started. So what's the role of scientific publications? So scientific publications will give your research a timestamp. It will say that you were actually the first one to mention a certain development within the field of science, So it's a registration of the time of inventions, but it's also a certification of results where the validity and the integrity of the results are tested through the peer review process. Also, through publications, you can disseminate your work to a much larger audience than you would if you just kept it for yourself. So, especially through online platforms like Science Direct and Scopus now, basically the whole world can find your research. So the power of dissemination nowadays is very big. And then the role of the publisher is also the preservation of the scientific records. So basically, you know how you have like floppy disks from like 30 years ago that you can't use anymore now. But the role of the publisher is really to make sure that the content that is, for example, on Science Direct in Scopus now, that it's also will be available in 100 years still, and that people will be able to read it no matter how the technology has evolved. So it's really preserving the archive of science as well. So this is basically the first issue of the Lancet that was published in 1823. And the Lancet is an Elsevier journal. And of course, we have these issues online on Science Direct as well. Those pages were all scanned. But yeah, some of the journals go back a very long time. And we make sure they remain available for people to read. So what is the academic publishing cycle? Well, you know, journals and editors will solicit submissions to their journals. Then the editors manage the peer review process. Once papers are accepted, they're edited and prepared for publication, and they go into production, where you know, where they're printed and then published online and disseminated to the scientific world. And so really, just to give you an idea of the scale of the publishing process. So if your paper gets rejected by a journal, you know, don't despair, because actually on average, most papers that are submitted to journals get rejected. So it's really not something that's rare. It's just a matter of finding the right journal to publish your work in. And in the end, every paper will get a place to be published in. And so Elsevier has more than 13,000 editors working on its 2,000 journals. So actually Elsevier has a bit more than 2,000 journals. I think it's like more like 2.5. But some of the journals that we publish are not owned by Elsevier. We might also publish journals for learned societies, you know. So they're the owner of the journals, but we publish them for them. So actually, I think Elsevier owns about 2,000 journals itself, and with 13,000 editors working on them. And those journals make use of more than 500,000 reviewers a year. So you can see it's a huge enterprise to keep this process going. And then of the more than 1 million submissions that the Elsevier journals get a year, about 400,000 articles are accepted for publication. And those articles are then made available online, and databases like Science Direct now have, you know, huge amounts of papers on them. Like, I think by now it's probably more than 13 million papers online for people to search. And those papers get downloaded, yeah, huge amounts of times, and by researchers all over the world. So just to show you the scale of how big the publishing industry is, there's more than 2,000 publishers around the world. You know, some publishers only publish one journal, and some publishers like Elsevier publish, you know, 2,500 journals. In total, nowadays, there are about 30,000 peer-reviewed journals in the world, so it's a huge amount of journals. So for an author, it's very difficult to decide which journal is the right journal for my work, you know? Where can I publish my results the best? And also nowadays, you have the concept of, you have some predatory journals also. I don't know if you've heard of predatory journals. But actually now you have journals that try to pretend that they are like the Lancet or something, and they'll try and trick authors in submitting their paper to them. But actually, it's not the Lancet, and you know, if you submit your paper to them, you end up getting published in a journal that probably doesn't even have an impact factor. But you know, so you have to be very careful nowadays with where you're submitting your paper to, and really make sure that you're submitting it to the journal that you actually have in mind, and that you're not tricked into publishing in a scam journal, so to say. So all these peer-reviewed journals publish more than 1 million papers a year. So also, and I'll talk a bit more about that later, it's very important that once your paper is published, you also do a lot of effort in getting your paper noticed, you know, because you can imagine if your paper is one of the million papers published per year, it's still hard for people to notice your paper, right? You have to try and make your paper stand out and make it get attention through like social media and those kind of things. But I'll talk more about that later. So this is just to show you how the number of journals has grown over time in the world. So in the at the start of 1900, there were less than 1,000 scientific journals, and now there's about 30,000 scientific journals. So just once you've performed your research and you're thinking about maybe I'm ready to publish a paper, it's very important to question yourself, do I already have sufficient material worthy of publication, you know? Do I have enough results? Are the results significant enough? Are they, you know, do they take the field forward, my results, or not? Or would it be better to do some more experiments and extend my research some more to make my results even more significant and, you know, publish a paper maybe, you know, a bit later on when it will be even, you know, advancing the field further. So it's very important to question yourself, is this the right time for me to publish, or should I do a bit more work? So what in general makes a strong manuscript? Of course, a strong manuscript needs to, you know, have good results and novel findings, ideally. But also just in terms of structuring your article, your manuscript should have a logical structure. It should be as clear and concise as possible, and it should be as easy as possible to understand. You know, so don't make your manuscript more woolly, so to say, than it needs to be. So editors and reviewers like to see manuscripts submitted to them that fit very well with the journal, that fit in the aims and scope of the journal. And it's also very important to question for yourself what type of manuscript you should be publishing. Like, there's lots of different types of manuscripts nowadays. You have the normal research papers, which are like full papers with, you know, and comprehensive pieces of research. But you could also publish your research as a letters paper, which is usually a shorter paper. Or, for example, in the field of medicine, you have case report papers, and case report papers usually focus just on the findings of one patient. Like a doctor might say, I had something so extraordinary the other day with one patient, and it really should be published because this is something new that I've never seen before, something and the world should know about it. Those papers can be published as case reports, so they're not like you know, statistically significant papers or anything like that, but they're interesting enough to tell the world about it. So, and then of course you also have review papers. Review papers are more like papers which give a comprehensive overview of the field. Like, they're usually longer papers, like can be 30 pages. And usually they don't have novel findings in them themselves, but they summarize findings of other papers that have been published already. And often the review papers are invited by editors. So if you're an expert in a certain area, an editor might ask you, could you write an overview paper of this and this, this and this development? So it's important to consider for yourself what type of paper you should be publishing. And then also in the last couple of years, new types of papers have arisen, which are more like, for example, specific journals that focus on methods only. So if you have developed a new method, you can get a paper discussing the method published in that journal. Or if you have a new software that no one knows about yet, you can publish a paper on that in a journal called, for example, Software X. So you also have journals now that are really just specifically focused on one type of development. And usually, when you're questioning yourself, like what type of paper should I publish, discuss it, of course, with your colleagues and your supervisor, because they will be able to, hello, they will be able to give you some clear advice on this. So choosing the right journal, of course, if you've published a paper and you think, well, this is a good paper, but it's not, you know, a world-class paper, then it's probably better not to submit your paper to the Lancet or something like that. You know, you have to be realistic for yourself, like what level of journal are you aiming for? And of course, so, you know, the level of the journal is important to consider. Also the scope of the journal. Of course, editors like to see papers that fit within the scope of their journal and not papers that fall out of that. Also, the readership you want for your paper. If you did research on sort of a new application, you know, and you really want doctors to know about it, then instead of other researchers, then it's better to publish your paper in a journal that's being read by doctors, so maybe a more clinical focused journal. So, and of course the impact of the journal is important, because funding bodies and institutions have requirements in terms of in what type of journals they like you to publish, like in terms of impact factor. So it's important for you to consider the impact of the journal, of course, when you select it. And then nowadays you also have the consideration of, do I want to publish my paper open access or on an open access model or on a subscription model? I'll talk a bit more about that later on, but nowadays you have journals that are purely open access. So if you select a journal that's purely open access, you don't have a choice. You have to usually pay an author fee to get your paper published. So it's important to consider that beforehand, before you submit your paper, that if I submit to this journal, it means I have to pay a $1,500 fee, you know, for publication. While if I submit it to a subscription journal and it gets accepted, I can publish for free, you know. So those are important considerations. So in terms of impact factor, I guess, do most of you know how the impact factor is calculated, or would you like me to explain it? So nowadays we have Web of Science, which is a big database like Scopus, and Web of Science is owned by Irbid. And they every year publish a journal ranking in terms of the impacts of the journals in each field. And basically how the impact factor is calculated is that it's basically an indication of the average number of citations a paper will get if it's published in that journal. But it's averaged out, of course. And so one paper might get more citations than the other, but the impact factor looks at the average. And it's calculated by the number of citations that the papers, for example, if we look at the 2017 impact factor of a journal, what we know now for journals is the 2017 impact factor. So it looks at the number of citations the journal had in 2017 to papers published in 2015 and 16. And then this number of citations is divided by the number of papers actually published in 2015 and 2016. So say the journal got 1,000 citations in 2017 to papers published in 2015 and 16, and it published 100 papers in those 2 years, then your impact factor is 10. The impact factor of the journal is 10. So that's how they calculate it. But we as Elsevier feel that the impact factor is getting too much importance nowadays. There's a lot more to scientific research than just how many times it's cited. And but because funding bodies and institutions still find it very important, we of course go along with this. But we think it's only looking at one way of looking at quality in one certain way, and not in sort of it's not a holistic measurement. So when you're trying to choose the right journal for your work, Elsevier has a very good tool. It's Elsevier has a journal finder tool. You can find it online on elsevier.com. And actually the journal finder tool, if you have your abstract of your paper ready, you can upload your abstract, the text of your abstract. And then the tool will tell you which journals would be suitable for your paper. And it's quite a useful tool because there's so many journals nowadays out there. And even if you have your own list already, it might be interesting to see what the tool comes up with in terms of suggestions. So if you Google Journal Finder tool Elsevier, you'll get to this. And it's a good way just to double check that you haven't forgotten any a journal that might be good for you in terms of aims and scope. So when you're considering where to publish, where to submit your paper to, make your don't just think of one journal, because mostly nowadays papers, it's not often that a paper will get accepted straight into your first journal of choice. You have to be realistic. So most researchers, I think, actually have a list of 5 journals, and in order of preference, you start at the top journal and then you go, to your next choice if it gets rejected by the first one. And it's important that all your authors agree to this list of journals. And actually recently I had a case where a student, it didn't look like the paper was going to get accepted into their first journal of choice, and they knew what their second journal of choice was. But it hadn't officially been rejected yet by the first journal, and then they already submitted the paper to the second journal without having the rejection. And then the paper ended up getting sent to the same reviewer. So the reviewer was like, hey, I've already seen this paper, for this first journal, and now I see it again. And of course the student, it was a bit too eager to move the process along, because you're not, in the scientific world, you're not supposed to submit your paper to 2 journals at the same time. And so in the end, both journals ended up rejecting the paper because of that. And so it's important to be patient also in the process and make sure you have your proper rejection of the first journal before you go to the next one. And then, of course, her supervisor said, she didn't know that it was so strict, and she didn't realize she wasn't already supposed to go to the, to the second journal. But editors are not so open to those kind of excuses nowadays, so it's better to be patient. And so once you've made your selection of journals, make sure you check the guide for authors for the journal that you're going to submit to first, because every journal has specific requirements that are important to take into account. And like they might have a controlled keyword list, or they might say you need to complete this and this form for, if you've done human clinical trials, or if you have conflicts of interest, So it's important to read the guide for authors of the journal that you're submitting to and try to stick to the requirements as much as possible. So just to recap, before you start actually writing your paper, so determine if you're ready to publish your work. Do you have enough results? Or would it be better to do a bit more experiments before you start writing your paper? Decide on the type of manuscript, decide on the right journal, and make sure you check the guide for authors for any special requirements. And then last but not least, it's also very important to decide at that stage who are going to be the authors for your paper, because it won't look good for editors if during the editorial process, your paper is already sent out for review, if then suddenly you say, oh, we actually forgot an author, because then, journals, it's important that the people who are authors for your paper are actually people that have actually contributed to the paper, not just in a sense of, in an administrative sense, like, you know, done the typing or something, but actually from the scientific point of view, you know. So, for example, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, they say, and every field can be a bit different in this regard, so you have to look at how things work in your specific field. But in the medical field, they say, and all the authors on a paper have to substantially have contributed to the conception and design, and or the acquisition of data, or the analysis and interpretation of the data. So really have had a substantial contribution. They need to have seen the drafts of the articles and the revisions, and have reviewed it for intellectual content, you know, not just for English, you know, not just for the grammar or something. They need to have given approval for the final version of the paper to be submitted. And they also have to agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work, you know. Sometimes once papers are published and ethical issues come up with the paper, you know, it might turn out that a whole paragraph was plagiarized or something. And then an author might say, oh yeah, but I didn't know anything about that. I wasn't actually involved in that bit, you know. And that doesn't, you know, if you're an author of a paper, you're accountable for the whole work, and you can't suddenly say that you had nothing to do with it. So, so being an author comes with credit, but also with responsibility. And so the Medical Association, they say that all 4 conditions must be fulfilled for someone to be an author. And if they don't fulfill these conditions, they should be listed. People should be listed as in the acknowledgement section. That's where you can mention, for example, your secretary who typed the paper, or someone who checked the English, but not as an author. And the other day I had from one of my journals a case where an author, after acceptance of the paper, the author said, oh, we actually want to add someone. And then the editor just goes, no, it's too late now, because it's too dubious, you know. Why would you have gone through the whole editorial process and then realize that you forgot someone, you know? I mean, that kind of makes it sound like it's someone who just wants to have another paper on their CV, and that's not the idea of authorship. So, so the editors didn't accept that. So what does it mean to be an author? Well, an author is generally considered to be someone who has made substantial intellectual contributions to the work. So decisions who should be the author should be made early, very early in the process. Nowadays it's becoming more and more common for journals to actually, at the end of the paper where you have the non-disclosure, of the conflict of interest disclosures, and also the acknowledgements, they'll have a paragraph on actually the role that each author plays within the study. Like, this author did the statistical analysis, this author designed did the design of the studies. So actually that's becoming more and more, especially for the top journals, a requirement for papers to be as transparent as possible in what the role of the authors was. So, like I said, being an author comes with credit, but also with responsibility. So when you start writing your paper, I'll talk now about the general structure of research articles. And like I said, it's important to read the guide for authors for any specific requirements of the journal you're submitting to. But basically, you start writing your paper from the bottom up, like, you start with your data and the findings of your experiments, and they're usually illustrated by figures and tables. And then, of course, they're the basis of your paper. So figures and tables should contain sufficient information to speak for themselves. Like the captions and the figure or table itself should explain what it's talking about. People shouldn't have to look through the text to then find an explanation of what what the meaning actually is. And only include the figures or tables if they're indispensable to the message you want to bring across. And the easier to understand, the more convincing they are, really. So don't try and make your figures and tables too complicated or too full with data. Sometimes it's better than to split things out if it's becoming too, cloggy. And really make sure that you use high quality figures and photos. And because if you use low quality, the editor, when an editor gets the paper in upon submission, they'll do a quick scan of the paper to see if it's suitable, in terms of sending it out for a peer review. And if they do a quick scan, they'll look at the abstract and they'll look at the figures and tables and maybe the discussion. If you have very low quality figures, it already will put them off straight away, So it's important presentation is important in terms of the first impression. It's like a first impression, like when you're applying for a job, the first minute is often the most important part. So it's the same with the paper. Because editors nowadays, they usually get so many submissions. I used to manage a journal that got like 8,000 submissions a year, And so the editor makes a decision like in 1 minute, like am I going to send this paper out for peer review or not? So you really have to make the best possible impression in that initial moment. Of course, not all journals get so many submissions. You have journals that get very little submissions, but usually the good journals get a lot of submissions. So it's important to make your paper stand out. So in the methods section, you describe how the problem hypothesis was studied. You identify the materials and the equipment used for your experiments. It's important to realize that your paper should give so much information that other people can replicate your experiment in the same way that you did. So you really have to give all the details as much as possible, because that's the thing with science, it should be reproducible. If other people can't reproduce your results, basically your paper was useless in a way, And if you describe a method which was already, for example, described by your supervisor in a previous paper, it's not necessary to repeat the whole that over again in your paper. It's better to quote, reference that article and say we used exactly the same method as mentioned in this paper. In terms of results, include only results of primary importance. Try and use your group certain types of results together to make them more easy to understand. Like I said, it should be clear and easy to understand, highlight the main findings, and provide statistical analysis. And also, it's also good to feature unexpected findings, actually. And actually, there are now also journals, in terms of specific types of journals, there's also journals now which are only for negative results, it will be the journal of negative results. So it's actually, because scientists will do, studies, right? And actually the study totally didn't find what you expected. So you think, oh, it's not worth publishing. But even negative results are worth publishing. People should know about them. Especially in like clinical trials and so, it's very important for people to know what didn't work. And so you now even have journals that are purely focused on negative results. So, but even within your paper, I think it's good to feature unexpected findings, things that you hadn't expected, but that showed up anyway. So the discussion is really the most important part of the paper. Here's, where you interpret your results and you compare your results to previously published results. of your own or of your group, of your supervisor. And the discussion, make sure that your discussion corresponds with what you wrote in the results section, and that it's all logical and to the point. And of course, usually discussion and conclusion are the most difficult parts to write about your paper, right? I mean, the results section is kind of clear because you're just reporting on what your findings were, but then in the discussion and the conclusion, you actually have to take it a step further. And in the conclusion, you provide a justification for your work, why you performed these experiments and why you thought it was important. And you explain why you think your findings advance the current state of knowledge. And you might suggest future experiments as well. Like often after study you think, oh, I should really look into this and this as well now, you know, or maybe I should have checked that, but we didn't, you know, get around to it, or we didn't have the experiment set up for that. And so those kind of thoughts for yourself of what you should maybe be doing in the future, it's good to include that in your conclusion. So once you've written basically your, you have your figures, your tables, your results, your discussion, your conclusion. That's really when you, when you start working on your introduction and your abstract. That you do that at the end, because you have to make sure that your introduction captures everything that was written in the body of the paper. So you write your introduction at the end. And the introduction will give the context to your readers, like why you thought this was important and what your main findings, what your hypothesis was. And it will tell people what you were trying to achieve with your study. And it might also identify the limitations of the study. So be sure that you write a unique introduction for every paper, because anyway, I understood from your library manager that your university uses Authenticate also to check papers in terms of text, similarities in text. And all Elsevier journals do the same. So any paper submitted to an Elsevier journal will come to the editor with Authenticate reports straight away. So usually, especially these editors that get thousands of submissions, that's the first thing they will check, And if a paper comes out with 80%, it happens, 80% overlap, straight away the alarm bells will go off, right? And of course then you should check like where is the overlap in the paper. But you're not going to have 80% overlap only in the references and the methods section, right? So so it's important to try and get this percentage down as much as possible. Please try and use your own wording for things in your paper, and not copy text literally, even from your own previously published papers. It's important to change the text just to get this, because it's good, of course, to use your own words, but also to get this percentage down, because the percentage will just, if the percentage overlap is high, even if it's not in important places of the paper, it will just make it harder for the editor to decide that the paper should go out for peer review. Then you need to think of the keywords for your paper, and the keywords are very important because they are the tags that will be used for search engines to find your paper, and also in abstracting and indexing databases like Web of Science and Scopus. The keywords are part of the title and the abstract. They're part of the metadata of the paper, and so they're very important in terms of people finding your paper. And some journals might have controlled lists of keywords. So they will say you can only use, they might have 50 keywords, and you can only choose your keywords from that list. So it's important to check the guide for authors in that sense. But it's very important to make sure that you use the right keywords for the content of your paper. And then, of course, the abstract. It's very hard to, basically the abstract should give a summary of your paper. But of course, it's very hard to say if your paper is 12 pages, how can you write in a very small piece of text, you know, your main message. And, but it's important that your abstract summarizes your hypothesis, methods, and results in a very short and concise way. And it should be easy to understand for people. And also, often, also for the editor, the abstract is the first thing they'll read to decide whether your paper fits in the scope of the journal and whether it's of high quality, enough quality to be considered for publication. So make sure that your abstract really reflects the content of your paper. And try and make it interesting and understandable. Yeah. So you also write your abstract at the end once your paper is basically in its final form. And then, of course, you also have to think of a title for your paper. So a title should really be something that attracts attention, or if it's possible, of course. It's not possible with every type of study, of course, but try and make it interesting. It should be concise and give as much information as possible. And don't formulate your, usually titles that are formulated as a question don't work very well, you know. Like, for example, you know, do vitamin D supplements improve healing in intensive care or something, you know, and then a question mark. That's usually not so, accepted. It's better to formulate your sentence in such a way, the title in such a way that it's not a question, but more like a statement. Hi. So in the acknowledgement section, like I discussed before, is really the place where you can mention people that have helped you with writing the article, but that are not suitable to be authors. In the acknowledgement section, or often nowadays, journals might have specific paragraph for conflict of interest disclosures. So they might have at the end, you have an acknowledgement section and a section for conflict of interest disclosures. So it's very important to disclose any type of conflict you may have, you know. If you've written a paper on a certain medication, for example, on the effectiveness of it, and you've received sponsorship from a pharmaceutical company, it doesn't even have to be the company that makes that medication. But just disclose that you've been a consultant for this and this pharmaceutical company. It's better to be on the safe side, you know, than think, oh, that's not really relevant, so just I better leave it out. It's better to give more, be more as honest as possible. So in the acknowledgement section, you also mention your funding sources. Also, and if there's none to report, you also say there's no funding sources were received for this study. And also conflicts of interest, and if there's none, you say no conflicts of interest to disclose. It's very important nowadays to be very explicit about that. And you may think, you know, if someone has donated materials for your study, you can thank those people or those companies in your acknowledgements as well. But I'll talk a little bit more about conflicts of interest under the ethics section as well. Okay, well here I'll talk a bit more about it. So conflicts of interest can really take a lot of forms. They can be direct financial conflicts, like you might actually be employed by the company that wrote the study, that did the research. You might have stock, in the company. You might have received a direct grant from the company. It can also be more indirect, like you've worked as a consultant for that company, or sometimes the company has hired you to speak at a conference on a certain topic related to the paper. And it can just be many forms, and it's just important to be, if you feel that there might be a conflict of interest, to be open about it. And you can mention these conflicts in your letter to the editor. And if you're not sure whether you should mention something or not, you can always ask the editor, do you think it's necessary for me to disclose this conflict of interest or not? So it's just important to be as open about it as possible. So then you get to your reference list, of course. In your paper you reference many other studies that have been done. But it's important, usually editors don't actually like it if your reference list is too long, because it also is a bit, of course, if all those references are needed for your study, then it's fine, of course. But sometimes if you're referencing 10 of your own papers, because it's important to know these references are all citations to those papers, right? So editors are mindful that you're not just giving references in your paper just to give those authors citations, because they might be your supervisors or they might even be your own papers. So it's important to just reference the papers that are really essential to your work, and not just as an addition to try and make the list be longer and therefore make the paper seem more, worthy or something. So actually, it's better to have a shorter list of references than a longer one. Of course, if you're writing a review paper, often review papers can really have lots of references because they're actually bringing literature together to summarize a certain topic. But for regular research articles, it's better for the reference list to be concise and to the point. And then also nowadays it's becoming more and more normal to publish supplementary materials with your paper. So of course in your paper you can only really have tables and graphs, and it's hard to fit anything else into your paper. But if you have a big Excel file with interesting data on which your paper was based, it can be uploaded with your manuscript on ScienceDirect, for example, as a supplementary file. Nowadays, with more and more stricter requirements on data sharing coming up, so you might have journals now that say you need to share the data on which your study was based. So you need to share all your data. And if authors, so then actually we have on ScienceDirect now that if you're sharing your data with your article, there may be, and maybe the data is not even in a supplementary file, but you've uploaded it onto like a data sharing platform, like Mendeley, or there's data sharing platforms per subject area. Then the paper will give a direct link from the published papers to that data set on the platform. So there's more and more publishers try and make everything more and more transparent. And if authors say, I'm not able to share my data for a certain reason, maybe it was a clinical trial and there's patient information and which they can't disclose, then some journals now require that the authors make an actual statement in the paper telling readers why their data couldn't be shared. So this data sharing thing is becoming more and more prevalent, and you might And every journal has different levels of requirements in that sense. Some journals might say, we like you to share your data, but if it's not possible, it's okay. But then have a data sharing statement in your article. But you'll see this coming up more and more, the pressure on researchers to share their data. Yeah. So in terms of language of your manuscript, of course, yeah, for non-English speaking countries, it's always, it can be difficult to, to have your paper in the proper English. And sometimes we always advise people try and get a native English speaker to check your paper. But sometimes it's also hard to find a native English speaker, right? Elsevier does have services through the Elsevier web shop. Elsevier has a web shop where you can actually get a proper language editor to check your paper, but then you have to pay for it, and often it might be like $100 US or something. So that can be expensive. But it's really important because language is one of the things that editors will check before sending your paper out for review. And if your paper doesn't have proper English, of course, it's quite easy for an editor to notice, and it could be a reason that they don't even send your paper out for review. So really try and make the English in your paper the best possible. And some journals might also have requirements. Of course, all journals are in English, but some journals say you need to use American English, and others say you need to use UK English, so check the guide for authors in that regard as well. So just some tips in terms of language. Yeah, try and use active voice as much as possible, which is like we found that avoid contractions like I didn't, or we couldn't, those kind of words. Try and write the words as full as possible. Avoid abbreviations that people might not know. Of course, abbreviations like DNA, everyone knows what it is, but try and avoid abbreviations that might not be as obvious to certain people. And minimize the use of adverbs like exceptionally clear, or a great turnout or something. Try and use, not use words like that. And eliminate redundant phrases as much as possible. Try and be clear and to the point, and don't make your manuscript more woolly, or to make it seem more interesting. So here's some more, like, in terms of, often you can make sentences quite a bit shorter than what they are by, replacing words like, and here's some tips in that regard. Yeah. So usually the shorter the better. That's the tip. So really try and make every attempt to make your first submission a success, but you'll be surprised how many papers get rejected. I have my journals, 50% of the papers are desk rejected. So they don't even go out for peer review. And it's just because the overload of submissions is so high, and journals can usually only publish, they might get 1,000 submissions, but they can only publish like 100 papers. And so, 50% are desk rejected, and then the other 40% are sent out the other 50% are sent out for review. And then of that, only a small portion actually gets accepted. So it's really important to try and get your paper through this first, this technical review, really, of before it's sent out for peer review. So really take your time to write your paper and take some distance from it at some point, because then if you look at it again, you usually find things that can still be improved. And ask your colleagues and supervisors to critically review your paper, and and be open to their suggestions. And we also, Elsevier has a platform called Mendeley. Like I said, it's a platform where you can host data sets, but it's also a social network for researchers, a bit like ResearchGate. And it's also a reference manager. So in Mendeley, you can sort of upload all the papers that are really interesting to your field, your area that you focus on. And by uploading your papers there, it's very easy to include them in your reference list for any paper that you might be writing. So it's a useful reference manager. And it's worthwhile to have a look at this platform to see if you think it adds value for you. And then, so once you've written your paper and everything is sort of in its final form, you can, upon submission of your paper, you can write a cover letter to the editor. And it's good to do. We advise people to send in a cover letter. It's usually not a like a requirement upon submission that you need to send it in, but it's your chance to talk to the editor and to tell the editor why you think your paper is special. And you can also, it's also a good time to disclose any conflicts of interest, which of course should also be disclosed in the paper itself, but it's also good to mention them up front in the letter to the editor, and especially if you have questions about it, like I do this and this work for a company, do you feel it should be, this should be disclosed in the paper or not? And usually the letter to the editor is also the place where you can suggest reviewers for your paper. You know, it's very hard for editors, like I have journals on nutrition, well, one of my journals is called Nutrition, you know, and the editor is not an expert on every aspect of nutrition, of course. So he won't know for each paper exactly who the best reviewers would be. You know, it's just impossible, right, for an editor to have a network that broad. And so it's usually useful for an editor to, if you suggest reviewers for your paper. But then if you suggest reviews, please be mindful that it might give a bad impression to the editor if you only suggest people from your own institute or your own country, you know. Actually, it's a place where you have to show the editor that you have an international focus and you have an international network. So try and suggest people that are actually in other countries, and because that will give a good impression to the editor. And you may also there, if you have a competing, for example, there's a competing research group in the US or something doing the same type of work as you are doing here, it might be a good place to tell the editor, please don't select a reviewer from this group in the US because they're actually doing the same type of work as us and we would rather not have them know exactly what we're doing. And that's acceptable, you know. That's not, it's not bad to ask the editor that. So usually this is what cover letter might look like. And also in terms of suggesting reviewers, it's very important if you suggest reviewers to give the institutional email addresses of the reviewers. If the reviewers all have Hotmail addresses or Gmail, it might, you know, there has been cases where authors have registered an email address under someone else's name, an expert in the field, so someone who they would suggest as a reviewer. But then actually the email address, they've created the email address for that author as a Hotmail or something. So actually they're invited to be a reviewer, and but it turned out that it was actually the author of the paper itself who then did the review on that paper. And of course that's reviewer fraud. It's not acceptable. And sometimes those things come out, and then if that comes out, your career can be ruined, right? So, so editors have a natural wariness towards Hotmail and Gmail addresses. So try, if you're suggesting reviewers, use institutional email addresses of those people. Yeah. So this is just you know, a quick overview of what leads to acceptance. You know, like so, attention to detail. Yeah, check your work. Make sure other people have checked your work. If you get reviewer comments, make sure they're you know, incorporated. Make sure the English is good. Well, and try and stick to the ethical requirements as much as possible. And basically, I think this is the time. Is it time for a coffee break now? Yeah? Because we're sort of halfway through. So this was on how to structure your article and how to prepare for publishing your article. And after the coffee break, I'll talk about the editorial process. So once you've submitted your paper to a journal, and the ethical issues. Okay, now I'll talk to you some more about the editorial process. Just to give you a bit more insight in what happens during the road to acceptance. It's not easy to get your paper accepted, so don't despair if it doesn't work out the first time or the second time, you know. You're not the only one, and everyone finds it hard. And also the editorial process for every journal, you know, may be different. You know, it depends really also on the size of the journal and how many associate editors an editor-in-chief has, on how the editorial process, what the flow of the paper is during the editorial process. And but I'll try and give you an overview of the most standard way of handling papers. So why actually do we do peer review? And this is, like I said earlier, it helps to determine the quality of the paper, the validity and the significance of the paper to the scientific community as a whole. It usually helps to improve the quality of the paper. With the reviewer comments, you can adjust your paper, revise it and improve it. So usually the editorial process is kind of handled through the publisher's systems, like Elsevier has EES or eVice, or you have editorial manager as a system. And it's good for publishers to manage these systems because we're kind of outside of this, you know, scientific arena, and so we're more objective in terms of just making sure that the process is handled appropriately. And then we leave the scientific part of the editorial process to the editors and the peer reviewers. And so in a way it works well for the publishers and the editors to work together in this sense. So the role of the reviewer is really actually, the review process is very much a trust-based system. You know, it's not nothing to submit your paper with your findings, your research that you've worked on for years, to some other experts in the same fields. You know, you don't know what they're gonna do with your data, and there have been cases where actually scientific content was stolen by reviewers, you know, and subsequently published, you know, by themselves. And so the review process is really based on trust, and it largely depends on the integrity of the reviewers. So for editors, it's very important to find reviewers for your paper that are worthy, are from, you know, good institutes, that they know the context of these people, so to say. And that's why it's often not easy for editors to find reviewers for papers, you know. It can be, most of my editors now say they have to invite on average 15 reviewers to get to 2 reviews for a paper. So it's really a tedious process, and that's why it can take sometimes quite long. And reviewers should really do their review in an objective manner and try and give constructive feedback to the authors. So there's basically 3 types of peer review. We have single blind peer review, which most journals would follow, is where the reviewer knows who the author of the paper is, but the author doesn't know who reviewed their paper. You have double-blind review. That's where the reviewer doesn't know who the author of the paper is, and the author doesn't know who the reviewers are. And that's more in the medical sciences, traditionally, double-blind. And it seemed to be more objective, of course. It's found that even in the peer review process, there's still prejudice towards certain countries, or also between female authors and male authors. So in a way, it's good to have the identity of the authors obscured, I think, from the process. But it's not always like that. And nowadays, it's more and more common to have also open peer review for some journals, certainly for top journals in the field. It's in this whole movement of transparency and accountability that also it's seen as a good thing that reviewer reports are made public. It doesn't necessarily mean that the identity of the reviewers is disclosed, but sometimes it is. But at least the reports that they wrote are published with the article upon acceptance. So that's becoming more and more common now too. Although, you know, most journals don't do open peer review yet. But for example, I manage the journal European Urology. It's the top journal in urology in the world, #1. And the impact factor of above 17. And they want to start doing open peer review now, where the reviewer reports are published with the published article. So what in principle makes a good reviewer? It's someone who provides objective and thorough advice on a paper, gives well-founded feedback to the authors, and constructive feedback. And a reviewer that gives a good recommendation to an editor. It's not so useful for an editor if a reviewer says, I'm not sure if you should accept or reject this paper, you know? And of course, for editors, the most difficult decisions are when one reviewer says accept with minor revision and the other reviewer says reject. And then the editor comes in and the editor needs to basically do a review of the paper themselves to decide which way is he going to go. Is he going to go with reviewer 1 or reviewer 2? So it's not always clear, you know. It's not like when your paper is rejected that it necessarily means that both reviewers thought it should be rejected, you know. So this is what a reviewer. So for journals, if reviewers are invited to review, most journals would have a kind of a form or template that the reviewer would need to stick to, and need to go through and answer the questions, and also, the reviewers would also have an opportunity to give more specific feedback on the paper itself. Next to answering these kind of questions, like on the English and on the novelty of the paper and those kind of things. So usually after review, the reviewer will be asked, what would you suggest for this paper, you know, except with minor revision, major revision, or reject, you know. That's basically what the options the reviewer has. So the editorial process, the most basic editorial process of a journal looks like this. They can be much more complicated. Some journals have 30, they get so many submissions that they have like 30 associate editors. So the editor-in-chief might do the initial check of submissions, and then the papers that go into peer review, they get, sent to 30 different associate editors to send out for peer review. And that's why within a journal you can have conflicting decisions, like you had with your dentistry paper, where one is, it's very hard for a journal to have all associate editors on one line in terms of what types of papers are we accepting and not. So one associate editor might reject a certain kind of paper, and the other associate editor might say, this is okay and it's acceptable. So it's very difficult for an editor-in-chief to make everyone aligned in the same kind of way, and that's why you might see papers published in a journal where your paper was rejected, and you think, hey, but this is kind of almost like a similar type of study, so why did mine get rejected? And that's because, yeah, it is hard to align the policy of a journal across all submissions. So, oh, sorry, one second. So when the author submits the paper to a journal, usually the editor-in-chief, if the journal's not too big, will screen the paper to see if it adheres to all the technical requirements and the English is okay, and to see if the paper is novel, novel enough, of high quality enough to go out for peer review. If the editor doesn't think the paper is high quality enough to go out for peer review for the journal, then it's rejected before peer review. Because if the editor already knows that this paper is never going to be accepted in a journal, then it's kind of a waste to use, valuable reviewer time, because a reviewer on average spends 4 to 5 hours on reviewing a paper. So it's really a significant chunk of time, of their time. And an editor doesn't want to waste a reviewer's time if the editor basically knows that this paper is not going to be published in the journal. So, so basically then you get a desk reject, as we call it, or a technical reject. So it's a rejection without external review. It usually happens if the paper is either out of scope, the English is not good, or the quality of the research is so low that it's already obvious that low for the journal. It's all relative, of course. I mean, if you submit your paper to the Lancet, of course, the standards are different than if you submit your paper to a mediocre medical journal. So it all depends on what you're aiming for. And so also a reason for desk rejecting for editors is if the Authenticate report shows up with a high level of overlap. And what's high is, it's hard to generalize on that, but usually my general finding is that if your overlap is less than 30%, you're in the safe zone. But we advise our editors that they shouldn't look at the percentage. So literally, they should just look at where is the overlap, because the Authenticate report will tell them where the overlap is occurring. And 80% overlap can mean that you have 1% overlap with 80 papers. So basically your overlap is kind of insignificant. Or you could have 80% overlap with one paper. So really the percentage, has to really be interpreted properly by editors. But if you want to be on the safe side, try and bring your overlap down as much as possible. So then the journal editor will, if your paper is not desk rejected, your paper will be sent out for peer review. But like I said, it's hard for editors to find reviewers for papers because everyone's busy. And so that's why sometimes the peer review process takes a long time. But if you still haven't heard, if your paper has been in peer review after 3 months, I think it's okay for you to sort of send a message to the editor and ask, what is the status? Because usually that will mean, they will have a look at the paper then and see, hey, what's going on. Of course, an editor will know if a reviewer has declined to review a paper, and then they will invite a new reviewer. But sometimes the reviewer, has already taken a month for their review, and they might have even forgotten about it. So I think after 3 months, if you've been waiting 3 months, it's good to chase the editor and ask them what is the status, because there could be something going on, and if an editor has 100 papers in process, it's hard for them to keep an eye on everything, But I wouldn't go and chase them after 1 month because, editors are busy people, and if you're too impatient, it might give them not such a good impression. Yeah. So then once two reviews are complete, the editor will make see what the reviews say. Maybe both reviewers say accept straight away. Then basically accept without revision. Of course, that's quite rare. But that would mean that you would get a message that your paper is accepted and you don't need to revise it. Usually it will say something like, you know, accept minor revision. There will usually be some suggestions in terms of what you can improve on your paper. So your paper will go back to you for a revision and you have to respond to the comments made by the reviewers. But if both reviewers say this paper should be rejected, then of course you'll get the message like,
Excuse me,
yeah.
When they say acceptance with minor revisions and you make the revisions, do the paper go back to the reviewers or the editor makes the decision?
No, so usually it depends a bit what the minor revision was. Like if the minor revision was just something that the editor can check whether you've done it. Like if it's quite a technical thing, like you know, change the language here and there, you know, change this wording here and there. If the editor can check that you've done it, then it might not go back to the reviewer. If it's a more, but usually for more substantial, you know, feedback, the paper will go back to the original reviewers once you've done your revision.
More time for the final decision.
Well, usually then the reviewer should usually gets back to the editor quite quickly, saying, yes, this is what I intended, so it's fine now or not. That process usually doesn't take too long to make. Yeah. So if your paper is rejected after peer review, you know, don't despair, because it really, you might feel that you're the only one whose paper is rejected, but it's not the case. Actually, over 50% of Elsevier papers get rejected. More actually, and I think it's even more than 2/3. But try and understand why your paper has been rejected, and consider the reviewer's comments anyway, and try and improve your paper accordingly, and then, you know, submit it to the next journal on your list for, you know, peer review. And but make sure that if you're submitting to the next journal, that the next journal doesn't really want to feel like they're the second journal on your list. So try and make it as little obvious as possible that it was already rejected somewhere. So make sure you don't, you know, in your cover letter that you don't mention your previous journal still or something. You know, try and make it as much as possible like as if it's the first submission. So if you're asked to make, if the reviewer comments are, you know, revise your paper. So usually major revision means, you know, that your paper may be published in the journal, may be accepted in the journal after your revision, but significant changes are required. You might be requested to do more experiments. So usually they're quite substantial changes you have to make if it's major revision. If it's minor revision, it means like basically your paper is worth publishing, but you need to make a couple of adjustments to your paper. It could be textual comments, but also just some things in the paper that might need a bit further clarification or so. But still, minor revision does not necessarily mean that your paper will be accepted in the end, but in principle, it's a pretty good sign that it should be accepted. So then you send your paper back to the editor with the revisions made, and it's important that you say if the reviewers had 10 comments that you had to address, then it's important to say for each comment what you've done. Like you say, okay, line, it's good to use the line numbers then, and say, okay, in line 50, you know, comment 1, line 50, I've changed this and this and this. And so try and be specific and go through each comment one by one. And if you don't agree with some of the reviewers' comments, that's also possible. The reviewers don't always have everything right. But then write a polite rebuttal explaining why you think their interpretation is not correct and you don't think the paper should be revised in that way. And then it's good if you write your letter to the editor in such a way that the editor is able to forward it to the reviewer together with your manuscript. So try not to be rude or something. Try and you know, make your letter to the editor kind of neutral. You know, yeah. So you know. Your paper, after revision, there's, especially if it's minor revision, there's a very good chance that your paper is accepted in the end. And of course, that's you know, when you can have a party, and you know, that's the moment that a lot of people wait for, and it feels like a big, it's a big milestone in to get your paper accepted in your journal of choice. And it's important to know that once your paper is accepted, things happen very quickly nowadays because it's all online, you know, online systems. So as soon as basically the editor clicks on accept, your paper goes to production, and so you have very little opportunity. Say if you find a mistake somewhere still, you really have to act very quickly because within a couple of days, say if the journal publishes author versions of accepted author versions of papers, so the author version of the paper might appear online without any typesetting. That can happen already within like 2 days. So so it's important to be mindful of how quick that can go. So basically, but not every journal, it depends on the journal whether they publish author versions of accepted papers, but basically here you see that the stages that a paper may appear in online is that accepted manuscript to author version. So usually it might have, you know, the journal logo. They might merge the author version with the journal logo on top and some journal-specific things, but basically no editing has happened on the paper yet. Then you will get the uncorrected proof online. So that's the typeset paper, basically, but without any, no corrections done by the author yet. Then the author, so if you, as an author, if you get the proofs of your paper, usually you have 48 hours to correct your proofs, to look at your proofs and correct them. So it's really, the timelines are very short in that sense. So you have to be very vigilant to respond quickly. And sometimes the message that you can correct your proof goes into your spam folder, so you might not see it. So it's important to check your spam folder and stuff and give your proof corrections within the 48 hours that you have for them. And then the corrections to the proof will be made, and basically then the version of your proof will be online. And then it's basically up to the journal, depending on if it still prints issues, printed issues, or if it's all electronic issues only, how quickly your paper will appear in the final paginated version online. You know, some journals still have the print version as the lead, so and they might have a backlog of papers to publish, so it could take like 6 months before your paper appears online with actually the final page numbers and the printed copy. And some journals are e-only, and basically compilation of issues might happen as soon as the corrected proof is available. So there's a difference there between different journals and the types of journals that you publish in. We still have editors that really like the printed issue, and for them the printed issue is still the default, and they like to decide the order of papers as they appear in the printed issue. And we also have journals where basically as soon as papers are accepted, the editor doesn't get involved in how the papers appear in the issue. They just get published on the basis of their acceptance time, and there's no ordering of papers within the issue itself. So there's really, for each journal, there's different ways of handling this. But especially as an author, it's just really important to know that things happen very quickly after your paper is accepted, and usually during this production time, that's also when you'll be asked to transfer copyright of the paper to the publisher. So this is also the time when, if you want to publish a paper as open access, you'll be asked by the publisher during this production process, do you want to publish this paper as open access or not? Because we need to know that before the paper is published, because the copyright line changes if the paper is open access. If the paper is published as open access, usually the author has the copyright. So this is something we need to know before the paper is actually published, because the copyright notice will then be different. And it doesn't mean, I'll talk a bit more about open access later on, but the payment for open access then happens later on. But to know the right copy line, we need to know basically upon acceptance whether you want to publish a paper as open access or not.
Regarding open access or e-journals in particular, what governs the number of papers they include in each issue?
Sorry?
For online journals only, they can publish unlimited number of papers.
Yeah.
Because it's just online. So what is the factor that makes them decide this number of papers in this journal?
Yeah.
Because if they receive a lot of submissions, they can increase the number of papers to reduce the load.
Yeah.
Does this happen? Or how
so most purely e-only journals that are only electronic and no print, most of them would follow article-based, we call it article-based publishing. So papers get published in an issue on the basis of when they've, as soon as they're accepted, they get published. And there's no further delay, basically. And it doesn't matter if it's how many papers get accepted. They just get published, It's unlimited, basically. Sometimes, a lot of journals, of course, have the e-only component, but they also have the prints. So then the e-only component is linked to the printed issue, and then usually the print is still the determining factor, because in the printed issue, the editor likes to have the papers in a certain order, and then he might select. It might not be on the first come first served basis, and so he might be selective, trying to have a good balance of different topics in the issue, and then of course. Then the print issue is the lead, and the e-version of the journal follows the print. Yeah, but the articles will be available in the impress section of the article impress section of the journal then. Anyway, but they might not have appeared in the final form in an issue yet. Yeah. So really, once your paper is accepted, you've written your paper, it's accepted, and then really it becomes very important to promote your paper, because with this publication overload, really, and information overload that everyone experiences, you see there's 30,000 people, journals out there publishing papers, How is your potential reader group going to find your paper and know that it has been published? So it's really important that you try and promote your paper as much as possible. And there's a lot you can do yourself. And because, yeah, it's hard for your readers to find your paper on ScienceDirect and Scopus and all these databases. So what can you do to promote your own work once it's accepted? Well, there's a lot you can do with, even on the online database like ScienceDirect and Scopus, to make your paper look more attractive. And I'll show you some examples after this, but there's content innovations which are maybe not necessarily part of the basis of your, of the body of your paper. But you have, for example, now on ScienceDirect, you might have seen that papers have graphical abstracts. So the graphical abstract is not something that appears in your paper, but it's something that appears in the table of contents of issues, and it will attract people's attention to your paper. I'll show you a bit more about that later on. When your paper has been accepted and it's been published, you'll get 50, instead of reprints, in the past you would get 50 printed reprints of your article that you could give to your colleagues. Now you get 50 share links, and they're basically links. It will allow you to share your paper with your network, and they can read your paper for free, basically. So make use of your share links. Make sure you post a message on your paper on your social media websites, like your research networks or your institutional repository, but also on LinkedIn and Twitter. Mention your paper as much as possible. And get your institute to maybe even write a press release on your paper, to give it extra visibility, so that maybe, maybe your research is so interesting that it's notable for newspapers, that it's interesting for them to mention your findings. And of course, submit your work to conferences as much as possible, either as poster presentations or as talks, So really try and get your research out there. And this is, for example, an example of a graphical abstract. If your journal allows for graphical abstracts, it will be given in the guide for authors. But a lot of Elsevier journals do this now, and it's just basically a visualization of the content of your paper. And it's a way to draw readers to your paper. And they will see this on ScienceDirect when they look at the table of contents of an issue. So this is another example, for example. And you might think, like, how do I make this? But often younger students, actually maybe in your department, or they enjoy making these kind of visualizations. So maybe you can get one of them to help you with it. Also on ScienceDirect nowadays, it's possible to have audio slides with papers. So it's a bit like supplementary material, but then in the form of an audio slide. People like to use this kind of interactive information. Also, interactive 3D models are possible now if you're in chemistry, and or video slides. There's lots of different opportunities to make your paper more interactive. And so, like I said, try and promote your paper as much as possible on social media, and Mendeley can be a good tool for that as well. It's a platform to share your publications on and connect with your network. And then once your paper has been published by Elsevier, you'll get a notification of your personalized research dashboard, and it will list all the papers you've published with Elsevier journals. So it not limited to one certain journal. And you'll be able to see for each paper how often the paper has been used, or in terms of downloads, or how many citations the paper has got already. The citations are then based on Scopus data. And so it's really interesting just to follow how your paper is going, and you can actually then also see from where your paper is being read. Like, so are most your readers in China or in the US? Or, so that information is there. And it can give you insight in, which research groups are maybe doing the same thing as you, or are really interested in your work. So it could give you opportunities for collaborations or things like that. And nowadays, more and more, of course, we have the impact factor. That's very important for funding bodies and institutions. But actually, the impact factor it says more about how important the rest of the research community finds your research. But actually now we also can measure societal impact more so. Like if your paper or press release of your paper by your institute is picked up a lot by social media, by people retweeting it or on Facebook, it might say more about actually the societal impact of your paper versus the actual scientific impact. And this is getting more and more important now, because sometimes societal impact says more about how actually your research might influence the way people live in the end, versus whether other research groups find your paper interesting. So this is something to watch. And on ScienceDirect, for every paper published on ScienceDirect, you'll have this kind of information on there. So you can see we work with a company called Plumex to provide these metrics for us. Actually, they've been acquired by Elsevier, so they're part of Elsevier now. And for each paper, we measure the societal impact. Then I'd like to talk a bit more about research ethics. There are basically three main forms of misconduct, research misconduct. It's basically fabrication of research data. So it's researchers just making up results. They never actually did the experiments, but they've just made up the results and wrote a paper on the basis of it. It happens, really. Falsification of research data. Here you could imagine, if a paper has, photos in it, and the photos are actually, edited to make the results seem more convincing. That can happen. And also plagiarism. We already talked a bit about plagiarism. Copying previously published work. It's not bad to copy previously published work in your own work, but then it's bad if you don't reference that work then appropriately. You need to reference your sources appropriately. So what aspects of a paper can be plagiarized? Well, it's not just the wording, actually. It's things like illustrations, photos. It's even lectures, It's not limited to just to the text of the paper. So really, a correct citation is very important. It's important also just to put your work in the context of the information that was already out there. But it's also important to acknowledge people that have done research on which you've based your research. And it's really to maintain the credibility of and the accuracy of the scientific record. So by citing the proper sources, people can see, can follow, what was done first, what were then the subsequent steps and papers related to that, and what have you based your research on. So it's really important to maintain that scientific record of proper citation. Just some examples now of, ethical misconduct that can happen. So if a researcher notices a paragraph in a previously published article that would be suitable as the materials and methods section of his article, is this a violation of, ethical requirements? And yeah, of course it is. You can't reuse text of a previously published article without giving appropriate reference to the previous work. And also, if you, for example, if you use a method that was already, you've used a method exactly identical to a method that has already been published previously, it's better, instead of repeating the whole method again in your paper, it's fine just to reference the previous paper and say that you use the method exactly as described in there. It's not always necessary to repeat the same information again. And is it possible to plagiarize your own work? Yes. A big problem for editors nowadays is that researchers have such a pressure to publish a lot of papers, to get, their next promotion, that the novelty of each paper is becoming less and less. And if you're not referencing your own previous work, you're kind of inflating to the editor what your findings, what your current findings are. You're not telling the editor, oh, I've actually already published this, and only this little bit, only this part of my paper is new and that part was already published. So by not being open about that, you're kind of misleading the editor, because if he had known that half of the paper was already published elsewhere, he might say, well, it's not really novel enough, or there's not enough data for you to warrant a new paper now. You actually have to do more work. So it's very important to be to cite your own papers in your work. So some examples of conflicts of interest. So a researcher who owns stock in a large oil company publishes a paper on the limited environmental effects of oil drilling. It's fine for the researcher to publish that paper if he actually did proper research on it, but he needs to disclose in a conflict of interest section that he has stock in this oil company. Same like a researcher who wrote a paper on the positive results of a new treatment option is also a paid advisor for the pharmaceutical company that is developing this treatment. You need to just be very open about that so that people can put your research in the context of, of that information. And for example, a researcher submits an article to a journal for which one of the associate editors is the head of the research department. So, if you submit your paper to a journal and one of the associate editors is actually your boss, that's fine, that can happen. But the editor-in-chief might not know that...
How would you disclose it?
Huh?
How would you disclose this?
Well, I would say that in the letter to the editor, because, in the letter to the editor you say, look, I know my boss is one of your associate editors, so please don't, because the editor will not necessarily make that connection, right? Because he gets 1,000 submissions, so he can't always make that connection. So you just tell the editor upon submission, like, this associate editor is my manager or my department head, so please don't use him as the handling editor for the paper. So it's just important to be open about it. So you don't disclose this in the conflict of interest section of the paper, but in the letter to the editor. Yeah. So a researcher has manipulated some photos in his paper. So what actions can be taken? Every case is looked at on the individual basis, of course. But we do have there are processes for these for every kind of misconduct. There's like the publishers have established a path of the steps that need to be followed to determine what the consequences, what the situation is and what then the consequences should be. But usually if there's an allegation of any kind of misconduct against an author, the first thing we would do is write to the author and say, look, this allegation has been made. What's your response to it? Well, if you then never get a response from the author, you know, the alarm bells kind of go off, right? But many authors come back and with a detailed response, and you know, and it's good then for the editor to know that the author takes it serious, right? Whether right or wrong. Then depending on whether it's found that the author has done something wrong, and the editors can decide to either publish a corrigendum on the article if there were actually some faulty things in the article, or retract the article fully from science rights. And I have had retractions of articles where there was just so much wrong with the content of the paper that we said we can't leave this online like this. But the thing is, if you retract the article, the paper will never just disappear from ScienceDirect, because the paper might have been cited already, so the scientific record has to stay. But what will happen is that we will replace the published article with the PDF of the article, and it will have a retracted watermark through it. And then the editor will write a comment with the article giving the reasons why it was retracted. Usually, especially with retractions, we'll also send a letter to the institute of the author to inform them that we're retracting this paper. And the institute, you know, then of course it's also in the institute's hand to decide what they want to do, if they want to take further steps in relation to the author. And the same for the funding body. And but then it's basically out of our hands. As a publisher and editor, all we can do is get the right picture of what happened. Either, you know, say the author was not guilty, or we do corrigendum or a retraction and inform the institute of this. And that's basically then where our responsibility ends. But these cases are never pleasant, and they always take a lot of time, you know, to work out what has actually happened. So basically, this is what would happen, if a paper gets rejected from ScienceDirect. So the scientific record will stay, but it will be clear to people that the paper has been retracted. And there have been some serious consequences, you know, in the world of high-profile people who've lost positions or lost, like, their doctorate because it turned out they did unethical things during their career. So who's really responsible for ethics? I mean, of course, the author always has to make sure that his paper is written in such a way that that there's as little chance as possible of getting any ethical accusations directed at them. But in reality, everyone is responsible for ethics. The institutes, the journals, the companies involved, and all Elsevier journals are part of COPE. COPE is the Committee of Publishing Ethics, and it's most publishers have joined this COPE initiative. And COPE gives very clear decision trees and procedures on how to handle any ethical allegations made on the paper. So now just a little bit more on open access. Has anyone ever published an open access paper, or is it something that is a big thing here, or not really?
They ask for $2,000 to pay for open access, which is the university will not support.
No, no. And so most Elsevier journals are still subscription-based journals, which means authors don't have to pay for them, but libraries pay the subscription fee. And but in Europe, especially, the trend is more and more that you know, funding agencies require their their researchers to publish the research that they've paid as open access. And then the funding agency will sometimes have a budget for the researchers to publish their paper as open access. And that's why a lot of subscription journals have the option for authors to publish. So in principle, the papers will be full on the subscription model. But if the author needs to publish their paper open access, the subscription journal will have a way of allowing the author to publish, make their paper open access. And so gold open access is really when the final version of the article is made accessible to the whole world. And so usually once your paper is accepted, the publisher will send you a message and say, do you want to, if it was just a subscription, if it's a hybrid journal, so it's a subscription-based journal, but they offer open access option, the publisher will write to you upon acceptance of the paper asking, do you want to publish this paper in the regular subscription model or as open access? And then you indicate what you want. And depending on your choice, the copyright line of the paper will be determined. So usually for open access journals, you have to pay a fee, you know, to get your paper published. And indeed, some journals charge $500 per paper, and some charge $5,000 per paper. Like the top journals, like the Lancet, I think, and so you pay $5,000 to get your paper published. The positive thing is then it's free for everyone, and we do see with open access articles that they get downloaded more by people, but we don't necessarily see that they get more citations. Some of you might have heard about green open access as well. Some funding agencies don't say you have to publish your paper as gold open access, but you have to publish it as green open access, which means that the publisher needs to, after an embargo period of like 6 or 12 months, so the paper gets published and it's under the subscription model, but then after 12 months the author is allowed to post, for example, make freely available an author version of the paper on their institutional repositories or so. So usually green open access is for example, the NIH in the US has this requirement. So their research can first be, for a year, can be under the subscription model, but then it needs to be freely available. So the uptake of open access is increasing. Like, as you can see, the majority of research output is still published under the subscription model, but the open access part is increasing. And especially in Europe now we have Plan S. I don't know if you've heard of Plan S. 11 countries within the European Union from 2020 on will mandate that their research needs to be published as open access. And they say it can't just be published in hybrid journals anymore, so we don't allow researchers to publish their research in subscription-based journals that offer an open access option. No, they really have to publish their research in pure open access journals. That's their requirement. So in Europe you do see this push now more and more towards real open access. So why would authors publish in OA journals? They want the community. So some authors might say, oh, I actually have some money left over in my research budget, so I can pay for my paper to be open access. Because they want the community to, anyone to be able to read their paper. And important reasons are also that it's funding body requirements, and sometimes institutional requirements as well. So if you're publishing open access, if you know beforehand that you have to publish your paper as open access because you've got a funding from the Wellcome Trust or something, and they have that requirement, then look for, so you need to publish your paper really in a fully open access journal. Then make sure you find a reputable journal, because sometimes open access journals are linked to predatory kind of titles, so make sure you pick a journal from, you know, a reputable publisher, I would say, and make sure they're not predatory in any kind of way. So, yeah, like I said, upon acceptance, you have to indicate to the publisher that you want to publish, that the paper should be published as open access. And then once it's open access, of course, it's great that everyone can read your paper freely. And you know, try and promote your paper as much as possible through your network. So that was really the end of my presentation. I don't know if anyone has questions or any other comments.
Probably not within the core of today's presentation. Is there any way to help researchers find the hot areas of research in their field? Are there any, other than browsing the abstracts of some papers?
I think for that kind of queries, a product like SciFile is more useful. Trends, yeah. So it's hard to, in Science Direct and Scopus, you can't really see that kind of overall trends, you know. But SciFile is a product which is based on Scopus data. And there you can, for example, see what are the top downloaded subject areas in my area, or top cited. But it's a product, yeah, it's a product that Elsevier sells, and it provides more data analytics, and that would give more insights like that, like what you're looking for.
Recommending our manager to give us
yeah. That's right. Yeah. So
actually, we had last trial for Cyber last month, and we have a session about Cyber. Actually, it's available on the YouTube channel. We have a trial for 1 month. But part of the Cyber trends is focus on the topics of area research.
Yeah.
Provide a tool for networking and collaboration with similar interests of researchers.
Yeah. Any other?
Sometimes we get invitations from journals. Some of them are reputable to submit an article. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so call for papers. Yeah, if they're really trustworthy journals, then I think it's fine. Sometimes journals, you know, they might have, they want to publish a special issue on a certain topic. So they might send out a call for papers asking people in that area to submit a paper to the journal. But you have to be very careful, because these predatory publishers that I've been talking about, they are very good at making their emails and their websites look almost like ours, but they're not, you know. And you click on the link and they say submit your paper, and actually you submit your paper and it's not going to Elsevier, it goes to, you know. I had a journal, one of these predatory cases, where one of my journals wanted to publish a special issue, and so we had the call for papers on the journal website, and this predatory publisher, they used the title of our special issue in combination with our journal title in a very clever way, and then they sent out a message saying submit your paper, and you know, if you're not vigilant, you would really think that it was authentic. But anything with links, like, you know, like even with the cyber security now, right? If you get an email from your bank with a link in it, never click on it, right? And it's a bit the same with journals. Don't click on any links, but go try and find the journal websites and make sure you're on the right website and submit your paper through there and not through a link that's sent to you. Because it's really a serious problem. Yeah. And you might, yeah, researchers that might have thought that they were submitting their paper to to say, Nature or something, they end up publishing it in something that sounds like Nature but slightly different, and without an impact factor, a journal without any impact factor, anything. And the paper is gone, right? You can't publish it another time in a real journal. So be careful with that. Yeah.
After the paper is being published, you have the authority to retract it or withdraw it after some complaint or you discovered something or something has appeared, something wrong with this paper?
Yeah, we do, yeah. I mean, there will be a careful process of making sure what happened and whose mistake was it? Was it the author or who? But if there was really something wrong with the paper and there was some ethical misconduct, then we can retract the paper. Yeah, and it happens. Yeah, and but there will be a careful deliberation. They're not easy decisions to make, of course, because we do realize it can ruin someone's career, right? And but there's COPE, this Committee for Publishing Ethics. For each type of allegation, they'll have a flow chart. That if there's an allegation, the steps you should go through as a publisher or an editor to work out what the final decision should be. Yeah.
ResearchGate asked us to send copies of our published articles, some of them from Elsevier.
Yeah.
So they make them public to subscribers. Are
Yeah.
we offending Elsevier or this is allowed?
No, it's not allowed. No, they're doing something illegal, actually. But they're very smart because they're making you do it. So if it's an Elsevier paper with copyright with Elsevier, then you're not allowed to upload it to ResearchGate and make it publicly accessible. But ResearchGate is smart because they're not doing it themselves, they're making you do it. But Elsevier is actually almost in a legal battle at the moment with them about that. But only if your paper is open access, if your paper, if it's open access, then it's your decision what to do with your paper. But if it's subscription, if it's published on the subscription model and the copyright is with Elsevier, then you can't upload it like that.
You cannot upload the final version, but can you upload like the supposed version or version?
You can have you're allowed to have the version before you submit it, like a reprint version. Yeah, that's allowable.
But you can send PDF copy to a researcher from other place. He asks you for a copy.
Yeah.
This is,
Yeah, that's fine.
But if he made it public.
Yeah, no, it's like yeah, that's right. Because you see, Elsevier wants the also if the paper is in lots of different places on websites, then the usage. We can't measure anymore who's reading the paper. We want all that usage to be on ScienceDirect so that we know, how often the paper is used, and we don't want it to be on all different places.
For example, Elsevier, it's open to our university, so
Yeah.
we can download what we want. So
Yeah.
we don't control.
No, you can download it, but then you can't put it on a website and make it public to everyone. That's the thing. You can send it one-on-one to your friends, but you can't make it,
So it's forever prohibited to put it in like ResearchGate or elsewhere, or just for 1 year? I mean, if you publish a paper with Elsevier or with Internet Medicine, how long it takes me to put it in my site as a full-length paper? I mean, as a PDF.
So if it's a published version,
Yes.
you can never put it on
Never.
ResearchGate. No,
Never.
no.
So if it is
What you can do, you can mention it on ResearchGate, and then it should link to the
You can put a
link to ScienceDirect. Yeah, but you can't put the full PDF on your website.
because you will lose $40 or more.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because sometimes, some papers want to get it from Elsevier. We find you buy it for this amount.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you are making money out of us.
Yeah.
We are the workers. You are
That's right. But also, it's not fair, like your institution is paying for the subscriptions and then other people could get it for free somewhere. That's not fair either.
Yeah.
I asked my kids in US, they sent for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Subscribers to.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can get a certificate for the workshop today if you go to this website and enter the code. You get a certificate of attendance for this workshop.
And
Yeah?
it does the frame, right?
That's right. Okay, and if you have any further questions, you can always contact me. My email address is there. So feel free to contact me. And like I said, on researchacademy.com, you can basically find a lot of all these materials. And also webinars and things like that.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. We enjoyed these 2 hours.
Okay,
And,
good.
you clarify many things.
Good.
Looking forward.